Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something that I've kind of brushed on before in a previous episode about, is college worth it? And I was having a discussion with a student about the concept of vocation that popped up in one of our readings, and it created an interesting idea to wrestle with, and that is how that word has changed over time and why we should always be looking for our vocation and trying to understand what that means. Now, when we think of vocation, especially in today's world, typically you might have recollections of a VOTech, a vocational technical training school attached to your high school or in your county. And the idea for that was to teach you some kind of trade. So going to VOTech was to learn how to be an electrician or a welder or a plumber or something along those lines. And that's kind of what we think of when we think of vocation, that it's some kind of trade thing. But that's not what the term means, nor is it what it was meant to mean. So I'd like to talk about the idea of vocation and why it's important to think about your vocation and the importance of vocation. So let's dig into the etymology of the word. So I pulled it up here. It says it's from the early 15th century, vocation, which means a spiritual calling, summons, or urging to a specific activity. From the Old French vocation, to call, consecration, calling, profession, or in the 13th century, to directly come from Latin vocationem, meaning a calling, or being called, from vocatus, called, the past participle of vocare, to call, which is related to vox, or voice. So as you can see, this is very heavily centered on a calling. It's not a trade. It's about a calling. What are you called to do? So whenever I discuss the idea of, is college worth it? And one of the aspects of that discussion was, well, what do you want to do? And you need to think about that kind of a thing whenever you're trying to figure that out. If you're a young person, even if you're middle-aged, some people are out there feeling like they're stuck in a dead-end job, going nowhere, feeling like they should be doing something different, something better, or something just, not what they're doing now. So what do you want to do? What do you feel called to do? Now, this doesn't necessarily have to have a spiritual implication, but obviously you have been given talents. Whether if you're a Christian, you know exactly where you got those talents. If you're not a Christian and you're just thinking of how you got them, either by experience or some education, whatever, but you developed some kind of skill set, some kind of talents. Where did you get those talents? And why have you nurtured those talents? I have certain talents, certain skills, certain abilities, and I want to use those in a certain way. And frankly, I've changed my vocation over time because it's one of those things of how it matches. Whenever I give the description of my evolution in how I got to become a teacher, it usually comes out of a situation. Whenever I start a new class, I have students fill out a piece of paper where they can ask me one question. If you can ask me one question. So instead of having students give their own little speeches of who they are, it's a get to know your professor day, because that's usually how we get to start everything. If they get to be more comfortable with me, it's easier for the class to go forward. So they fill out one question, and the question inevitably is, how'd you get to be a teacher, or do you like being a teacher, things like that. And the answer is well, it's not simple. And the truth of it is most people in college will change their major 3 to 5 times. Most people change their career 3 to 5 times. So I kind of fit in that mold. So going back way before college, when I was in junior high, I had decided I wanted to be an architect more than anything. I loved the idea of drafting houses, and the thought of being able to draft and design houses was just incredibly appealing to me. The idea of blueprints and things like that, I just loved it. So I started taking those kind of classes. So I started taking, of course, algebra and geometry. I started taking drafting classes and learning how to do all of that work to prepare myself for that field. As a result, I was really getting, mentally and emotionally, I was just geared up to be an architect, and I couldn't wait to jump into that world. Then 11th grade came, and that was the year that I was to take trigonometry. Did not understand that for the life of me. And it dawned on me one day, I got a quiz, and I looked at it, put my name on it, and turned it in. Blank. And that's how I knew. Dropped the class, took college algebra, so took yet another algebra class to fulfill my math requirements to get out of high school. So I took college algebra and, entered college as an undeclared student. That's scary. So whenever I have undeclared students come my way, I always tell them, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. I mean, if you think about it, it's a terrible disservice that we do as a people, as a society. We tell 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, you need to know what you're going to do for the rest of your life. Before you go to college, you have to know exactly what you're going to do. Clear up to your age 72 and retire. What a weird thing to say, because again, we change our careers multiple times. So to tell 15, 16-year-olds that you need to know exactly what you're going to do is totally unfair. And that's also the part of the problem with colleges. We've turned colleges into trade centers where you go and get a very specific major to do a very specific job. That's also unfair. So instead of going to college for a job, you should be going to college for an education. That's a totally different mindset. So if you go into college undeclared, I tell students, don't worry, that's what I did. And what I did, I just took classes that sounded interesting. In fact, the one that propelled me on my career track is I had a friend, Rob, in drumline, who was taking a radio class. And he said, hey, take this radio class with me. I said, okay, sure, why not? Turned out I loved it. I loved radio. Radio was so much fun, and it was interesting to do, and it was just a neat way to express myself. And I love music, being a drummer, so it's like, this is great. So I started working in radio. I started working at the college radio station. I did that for about a month, but then it closed down because of funding. The campus where I went at Slippery Rock University, they had two different radio stations, and one got killed. And I was working at that station, so out. So instead of trying to figure out how to get into the other campus station, I actually looked outward and found a town radio station in nearby Mercer, PA. I worked at that radio station for a year. I worked at another radio station for a year, out in Greenville, PA. So I started doing, radio, actual real radio, while I was still in college. So I would take my classes and then scoot to the radio station and be a DJ, and that was my job. Loved that to death. It was a lot of fun, and I thought, this is something I want to do. So eventually, I became a communication major. Now, while working at the radio station, I also had a general manager who asked me, do you know how to write advertisements? Write the commercials. I said, well, I took a class in it. I'll give it a shot. So I started writing the commercials. And then you don't just write the commercials, but you also have to produce them. So you go into the second studio. So there's a main studio where all the broadcasting happens, and there's a second studio where you can do recording. So I was in the second studio, and I was cutting commercials, and I thought, man, this is a lot of fun, where you get to get the phraseology right to try to convince people to buy the product. You get to do the different voices or sound effects or whatever to just get that work. I even had my friend Ken come, and we did a back and forth bantering for one commercial, and that was fun. And it was just like, this is actually more fun than working in radio. So when I got out of college, I stopped working in radio, and I started moving towards writing, and eventually became a professional writer. And I thought, this is great. So I get to work professionally as a writer. So I'm working for a couple different large companies, who are global leaders in what they do. And I was in their marketing communication department. I get to write, public relations work, product descriptions, feature stories, anything that they would have me write. And this is a lot of fun. I enjoy writing. So wordcraft is a lot of fun for me. I really enjoy this. I get to express myself. This is fun. And then I was asked if I would be willing to teach a writing class at a local Penn State campus, because I was a writer. Surely I could teach writing, right? So someone asked if I'd be willing to try it. Next thing I know, I'm in the office of the hiring person, and I became a professor. It was part time, so I was still writing full time. And then next thing I know, I'm starting to teach a class here and there. And it didn't take too long to realize I like this more than I like writing. And, again, I get to express myself. I get to talk about the things that's interesting for my work, and I get to inspire other people to get to like this stuff too. So you can see how, like, there's this ongoing evolution of just different doors being opened up. So God would open up a door, and I wasn't afraid to walk through it. And I tell my students that today. If God opens a door, walk through it. Worst case scenario, you go, this is terrible, and you back out. But chances are, if a door is getting open to you, there's a reason. Especially if it's an interesting door. Don't be afraid of what's behind the door. If you get a chance to go through it, go through it. It's not going to like ruin your life to go through a door. So go through a door and try it out. So I kept trying these new things that sounded interesting, and some of them were a little scary. Like, becoming a professor was just a weird thing, to be honest with you, because I finished college in 3 years, not because I was super smart, it's because I was dying to get out. So I took as many summer classes as I could, anything, just to get out. I wanted to get out of college and just get into the world and make my mark. And then boom, I'm back in there 2 years later for grad school, and then back in there to get start teaching. And then from there it led to me getting my doctorate, because if you want to teach full time, you pretty much have to have a doctorate. So here I am, going after a doctorate, to teach full time. And it's just one of those things that I never thought, in 8th grade that I was going to be a professor. And then when I got to college, I certainly didn't think I was going to be back in a college, classroom, let alone to get another degree, let alone to be a professor. But again, now when I look back at things, it makes perfect sense. I was called through each phase to help me be where I am. So now where I am, I'm teaching audio and video production and other modes of communication, which is kind of weird because that's how I started, in college, doing audio video production, and now up to doing teaching it. So it's come full circle, but in a different kind of way. But that's my calling. It's my vocation. I have, like it says, it's a spiritual calling, a summons, an urging, a consecration, a calling, a profession, a calling, being called. I kept being called, literally in some cases, to, do you want to try writing a commercial? Do you want to try teaching? I was literally being called to shift what I was doing, and I was willing to answer the call. That's something I think it's important for people to understand. Not because, hey, I know everything and I know if it works for me, it's going to work for you. I just know that if you are willing to try something, what's it going to hurt? I know that, some things do work out well and some things do not work out well. But certain things build blocks for the next thing to happen. So in my situation, everything I did was a perfect building block to what happened next. And it's just a matter of being willing to listen and willing to try. Now, this isn't, of course, to herald the importance of a college education, because it opened up all these doors for me. Or I can be, look at me, I'm a professor because I got a college education. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. It's that I was willing to listen to the call. So you might be called to do a trade, and thank goodness for that. My pastor just recently had issues in his home where the plumbing was all messed up. His theology degrees are great, but they couldn't help him with his plumbing. Who could? A plumber. And the plumber became one of the most valuable people to him. So we certainly need people who do trades. We need people who do white collar jobs. We need people who do some of the really advanced professions as far as education goes, like a doctor, like a lawyer, like professors and whatever. We need people in all of these areas, all these different sectors of society for it to work. But if you try to go into those things, and I hear students a lot of times like, why do you want to do this? Because I can make a lot of money. That's not a calling. That's greed. To be blunt, that's greed. But don't you need money? Well, yeah, everyone needs money. but do you need a lot of money? And you'll find a lot of times that people who go after the money find unhappiness really fast because they didn't chase a calling, they chased a dollar. And that's not going to bring happiness. I mean, yeah, you could buy stuff that makes you happy, but eventually you're going to start feeling unfulfilled because there's no calling. So you have things that you like to do. Well, put that into play. Even if it is a little bit harder to make things work financially, they eventually will catch up. And at the very end, you'll still be happy though. One of the things that's always frustrating is the idea that if people, could just, if they go and chase a college education or some other thing that makes them happy, that people poo-poo it as if like, oh, what are you going to do work with that? Like, oh, you're getting a degree in philosophy. What are you going to do? Work at the philosophy factory? Ha ha. Well, no, there's no such thing as a philosophy factory. But the people who study philosophy know how to think deeply about things, know how to reason and work through things. So the next time you're at the factory and you're having negotiations over contracts, that's philosophical work. Oh, I didn't think of it that way. Right. And we typically don't, because if it's not what I'm doing, I'm going to make fun of your other thing. So there are degrees out there that are seemingly silly and worthless, of course. But there are, but the vast majority of degrees, especially traditional degrees, traditional fields of study, have great worth. And they have great worth for a reason, because they advance the human cause, the human condition. And, as the saying goes, if you like what you're doing, you'll never work a day in your life. I mean, that's mostly true. I mean, the joke inside the profession for teaching is that, I teach for free, but they pay me to grade. I do work. I joke with my colleagues all the time, like, we have a great gig. We get to stand in front of people and talk about the stuff that we like, and we get paid for it. I mean, that's with a wink and a nod, because at the end of the day, I still have to grade. I have to go through all the process of grading. Plus, there's also the burden of teaching all the students before me. So this semester, I have like 85 students or so. My goal isn't to get them to pass. My goal is to get them to think. Getting them to pass isn't hard. I mean, you can just do whatever you want with the grading just to make it so they can pass, or hold their hands enough to get them to pass. My goal is to get them to think. That's a burden. That's a lot harder to get somebody to think, to teach them how to think, to teach them to think on their own and not just parrot what I believe, because, I'm not going to tell you what I believe. I want you to think about what you believe and then be able to espouse that. Because when you go out in society, you can't just parrot what other people think or what talking points you're supposed to say. You're getting hired to think on your feet, to come up with new creative ideas, to come up with solutions. You need to think. So you better feel like you have a calling in that field, because otherwise, if you go to do a thing, and I go to school, whether it's trade school or college or whatever, to do a thing, well, what happens when that thing changes? Especially if it radically changes, then you end up going to get retraining to do the newest thing. Whereas if you go to college to think, or you do any kind of learning on your own to think, when things change, you adapt. And if you have a calling towards that thing, you will appreciate and understand why it changed, which makes adaptation so much easier. So in the communication world, when things change, I'm like, that's cool. So, yesterday I was teaching my students about the history of radio. And most students today don't listen to radio. Most people don't listen to radio, which is why radio stations die. But they listen to podcasts, like this one here. So people listen to podcasts like crazy. What do you think podcasts are? It's radio for the 21st century. So that's what we're working on and dealing with and wrestling with, is the change from early radio to corporate radio to radio dying to the rise of podcasts, and then whatever's next. It's just understanding how to shift and pivot. But I love this stuff. And that makes the shift exciting. It can be frustrating at times, sure, but it makes it exciting and interesting, and I can see the pivot a mile away. And it's one of those things that it's a fun thing to wrestle with. Again, I have a calling for it, and I can feel and sense and understand that calling. what's your calling? So if you're in a dead-end job and you're thinking, I don't like this, what do you like to do? What would you like to do? If money wasn't an object, what would you like to do? If you're interested sitting on your butt on a beach, that we're not talking about the same thing. I'm talking about your vocation, your calling to your work. What work are you being called to do? What do you enjoy doing? Do you like working with your hands? Then maybe you should go look at that. Oh, but it doesn't pay me as much. Maybe some of those jobs do, or maybe you could figure out how to merge what you're currently doing with some of that, or do some of that on the side as a side hustle. But figure out what you like to do and start working towards putting that into play. It might be scary. I'm not going to hide that one. It might be scary because changing your whole job idea, your career is sometimes unsettling, but it'll end up being rewarding, not necessarily financially, but internally. So if you're making that bread, but you're doing something you hate, is it really worth it? You loathe getting up and going to work. Wouldn't it be cool to get up and be excited about going to work? And you might make less money, but you'll be excited to go to work. And when your excitement will catch on, and you won't care too much about the money anymore. And maybe you'll start making even more because that excitement is contagious, and you'll do better work, and people will hire you because you do better work. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thank you for tuning in this long anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.